Hi, welcome to an episode of Psych Specifics. Today with us is Professor Suzanne Baker. Thank you for sitting down with me today. Let's get started by looking into your specialty. In Psych 101, the students learn about the different perspectives or subfields within psychology, such as social, cognitive, clinical, and so on. Which of these perspectives best describes your training or research area?
So, pardon me. I think what you're asking about is kind of my subspecialty of psychology. So, in a broad sense, my background is biological psychology. That's what I got my PhD in. My specialty is comparative animal behavior. So, instead of looking at, a lot of psychological processes and things in humans, my primary expertise is looking at behavior of non-human animals.
Okay. Based on your specialty and your training, what do you specifically research and what drew you to that? Can you give us an example of interesting findings from your published studies?
So I'm going to kind of talk long-term because I've been here a long time. Mm-hmm. And over the course of my career, I've done multiple different kinds of research. When I was in grad school, I did a lot of research with a lot of different species. So non-human primates, horses, mice. There were probably a few others in there. When I came to JMU, I focused my research primarily on the behavior of mice, not laboratory mice like, people often study in a biomedical sort of setting, but a species of mouse called the deer mouse, which is a native North American field mouse. So if you went out in an area around here, like a wooded area or maybe a cornfield out in a rural area, and you were to trap a mouse, you would probably get a deer mouse. So this is, pardon me, a native North American species. One of the reasons that I like studying in the lab is that they thrive and they do very, very well in a laboratory setting. But we can also use them to look at kinds of basic types of behavioral questions using observational studies. So in the past, my students have done studies looking at things like foraging in the laboratory setting. So how do animals learn and remember the locations of food sources when they're traveling through their habitat? We've looked at nest building behavior in these animals. So a lot of kind of basic behavior types of questions. I'll show you a picture even though your listeners can't see it, but you can see how cute they are. I think people
they are indeed very cute, guys.
Yes. I think people have an image of mice in their minds, and I'm always like, no, these are the cute ones. I mean, look. Yeah. So I did a lot of research with mice. Since COVID, my research has shifted more toward looking at human attitudes towards animals. So what animals do people like and which ones don't they like, and what sorts of things is that correlated with? So a few years ago, I had a lab group that did a study looking at, we showed people pictures of animals. We asked people, do you like this animal? Had them rate it, scale of 1 to 7. And then we asked them to look at a series of adjectives and tell us which ones of those they thought were characteristic of that animal. So these were adjectives, things like beautiful, awe-inspiring, ugly, frightening, humorous, a whole bunch of those sorts of terms to try to get a feel for how do those attributes that people give to animals, how do those impact liking, for example. Another set of students that I had just a couple years ago did a study looking at people's level of moral concern for different animals. That is, do you feel like you care about this species as much as you do a human, or is it another layer out, or do you have no moral concern at all about what happens to them. And then looking at how that correlated with how much do people say they like the animal, and how much do people say that they would be willing to like give money for conservation of that animal. And not a surprise, but a very strong correlation between people saying that they like an animal and their level of moral concern for that animal and the amount of money that they're willing to give for conservation for that animal. So those things are really tightly intertwined in people's minds, which I think is interesting because it kind of puts that, you know, when we're looking at, well, you know, where do people's attitudes come from? You know, there's clearly a strong sort of moral or ethical component to that, that there are certain animals that it's like, I feel, you know, a sense of moral concern for them, and that, yes, this is something that we need to take care of this.
Right. Do you, this is not a part of this, but I'm just like interested.
Sure.
Do you think it's like about how closely the animals that they feel positive about, that they're like in our household or like in zoos or extinction or stuff like that?
Yeah, so we specifically left out animals like dogs and cats because, or other pets, because those are clearly, they're sort of in a different category because they live with us, right? Yeah. So you would expect people to have, you know, moral concern about a dog, for example, for many people. Not all people, but for many people. So we specifically focused on wild animals. And some of the results about liking came out in a pretty predictable way. There have been lots and lots of research studies showing that if you ask people what animals they like, mammals at the top. So, you know, bear, a fox, you know, elephant. Birds are often pretty high up there depending on the bird. Some birds are very high up. Some birds are not so high up. And then animals like fish and reptiles, and then insects at the very bottom. So unless you're talking about a butterfly, a ladybug, or a dragonfly, people tend to like those or feel more positive about them than people tend to dislike bugs.
Right.
Yeah, bees are in a little weird situation. Some people like them, some people don't.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah, it's very interesting,
it is very interesting
to look at the diversity of these attitudes and then what is this related to.
Yeah.
And we do see some species that have a really clear, kind of almost, not quite, bimodal isn't the word I'm looking for, but it's like, okay, there's a lot of people who really like this animal, and then there's a lot of people who really dislike this animal. So an animal like a shark, for example, where a lot of people are going to rate sharks negatively. You might think, well, it's because it's frightening, it's potentially
like violent,
dangerous. But then you have a lot of people who really rate predators highly, and so they like sharks. They think they're powerful and they're fascinating, they're awe-inspiring, and they're beautiful. So that's some of the kinds of research that I've done. My current lab students are working on a study. We're really just getting started with it, looking at nature and experiences with the animals and psychological well-being. So how do things like everyday experiences with nature, like something that you might experience out on the quad, for example, like do you see the mountains in the distance, or did you hear a bird singing, or did you watch a squirrel, you know, running across the quad? How did those everyday experiences with nature, whether you pay attention to them or not, and how does that affect like your sense of well-being? Or those are some of the types of things we're looking at. I'm sorry that was a long answer to your question, but I always tell people, don't ask me unless you really want to hear about it, because I have a hard time not talking about it.
My next question is also not part of this, but
Sure.
like I'm just like also really interested.
Sure.
So if you're listening to this podcast as a psychology student, or if you stumble upon this podcast as a like a junior or senior psychology student, you might be looking into your future and like picking out what you want to do with your life and like careers, and if you want to go into like research or being in clinician, like stuff like that. So how did you know this, and what factors went into that deciding? Because I know right now, as a about to be second semester senior, like this year, like these are the tough questions.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, do I know how I ended up liking animal behavior or how I ended up being a college professor? Or both?
How you ended up liking animal behavior.
So, when I was an undergrad, I had a lot of very diverse interests. So, I took classes in lots of different things. And I did not declare my major until the very last moment when they made me declare a major. I ended up in psychology kind of by default because I didn't have enough classes and other things to graduate on time. So I ended up as a psych major, but I realized early on the parts of psychology that really interested me were the more biological types of classes. So classes in biopsych. I got to work in operant lab with one of my professors, and I really liked working with the animals and handling the animals, and I even liked cleaning up after the animals. And I also took a lot of biology classes. So I took some field biology classes, some like vertebrate ecology classes, and just realized that I really liked animals and that I wanted to do something related to animals. Plus, I really liked academia. I liked studying. I finished my time as a psych major, and I felt like this isn't enough. I feel like I've just kind of barely gotten started with learning the stuff I want to learn.
Yeah.
And so I looked for graduate programs in in animal behavior. So.
Yeah. I think that's a really great way to decide if you are ready for grad school. And if you want to further, if you like feel like you're not done.
Yeah, I
learning.
just really.
I've never thought of it that way. So that kind of like helps me personally too.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple ways to think about that. I mean, for some students, you know, they'll come and talk to me as an advisor, and they'll be like, "Well, I know I have to go to grad school," and so I'm looking at that, and I'll be like, "Well, why do you have to go?" Well, I just always heard that you have to go to grad school if you major in psychology. And then I remind students that's not the case. I mean, you know, we graduate out of this department, you know, 200 or 300 students a year. They don't all go to grad school, but they're gainfully employed doing many, many, many different things. And so I think one way to look at it first is just like, you know, what is it that I want to do? Or do I have an idea what I want to do? And do I need to go to grad school for that? Because you might not need to.
Right.
So that's one kind of motivation that a lot of students have. But my motivation sincerely just came from, I like school. Yeah. I know not everybody feels that way. So I liked what I was learning. I wanted to keep doing it. I looked at, you know, my faculty members, my professors, I saw their jobs. I was like, that job looks like something I might like doing, you know. So,
Great. Good discussion.
I know, I'm having fun.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to based on
you got a lot of questions. So
yeah. As you know, psychology is an incredibly interdisciplinary field. How do other disciplines outside of psychology integrate the findings or theories from your field into their own research or practice?
Yeah, so for animal behavior, this is an interdisciplinary field.
For sure.
There are people who do research and work in animal behavior who have degrees in psychology, degrees in biology, wildlife management is another area, conservation biology. There are people in veterinary medicine who need to have an understanding of animal behavior. I think I said wildlife management, so people who work in conservation and so on really need to have an understanding of animal behavior. So it is by its nature a very interdisciplinary field because it does, it touches a lot of different things in the world, you know, all the way from, you know, someone who's a veterinarian, you know, many of the problems that veterinarians often hear about from their patients / clients are behavior problems. And so having an understanding of what is this behavior, what does it mean? There are people who do consulting, for example, for people who have like dogs with behavior problems. So dogs that are over aggressive, or dogs that have separation anxiety, or, how do I keep my dog from always knocking over their trash, and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's very
broad.
Yes, it's very interdisciplinary field.
Very Psychology, Psych 101 fulfills the JMU social cultural requirement for Gen Ed, meaning that the students are expected to learn to understand people who might be different from them and the importance of multicultural perspectives. How do you think about the role of culture, different social identities, or multicultural perspectives in the context of your research?
Yeah, so in my research specifically, obviously when I'm watching mice, that's a different thing because mice don't really have a culture. I mean, they have a culture, but it's mouse culture. Right. In some ways, I find it really interesting to study animal behavior from that perspective, because I think it really does give you an appreciation for diversity of behavior in general. Mm-hmm. Not just diversity of human behavior, which is clearly there, but if we look at diversity across all species, one of the things that I talk about in the animal behavior class is all species have to solve problems of living, right? They have to find food, they have to find a mate, they have to evade predators, they have to form social relationships. And so looking at the ways that different species do this is one of the things that we really focus on in the class. In terms of research, one of the things that I really want to get to the point of being able to do with the research that we've been working on, looking at attitudes towards animals, is to expand our study population. Because we've been looking at JMU students, which is one very specific sample. And we can compare their results to other studies that have been done, sometimes on very broad samples, even international samples. But I'd like to get to the point where I'm doing more of that, bringing in other groups. So maybe using something like, what's the thing that Dr. Melcory uses? Dr. Blankenship uses it as well. Amazon, MTurk, where you can get survey responses from a really wide group of participants. So that's for the research. In my class, I've been trying to bring in more and more diverse perspectives on animal behavior. So I have like an optional assignment in my class now looking at things like just the human element that goes into researching that, and some interesting questions like, do men and women research different topics? Why might that be? Or how do we bring in things like indigenous perspectives on animal behavior? Because, you can study animals from this kind of Western science perspective, but we also have to keep in mind that people have been living with animals for thousands and thousands of years. They know something about their behavior. How can we use some of that perspective to give us, enlighten isn't a good word, but to enlighten our perspective on their behavior in ways that we might not think about otherwise.
Right. When you mentioned broadening your population, I was thinking of like different countries, and because like there's so many different cultures where they just treat or think of animals differently, or even like spiritually. Yes. And obviously, like if you were to keep it like in United States, like different age group, like an older population, see what happens there.
Yeah, there are all of these, we tend to think of, if you ask someone, well, why do you like this animal? Oh, it seems self-evident. Right. But those are very culturally, influenced. So culture has a role to play, religion, even things like media representations of animals. So, I've asked my students before, one of the things I've done in the past is give a survey just to the class to see what animals they like, and turtle is often really high, and so I would ask them, what is it with y'all and turtles? And one semester they all told me about, it was a book that they read as children, and they all knew this book, and it had a really profound influence on their, turtles are great. And I was like, well, this is a really good example of how even things like how a species is presented in the media can, influence our perception of them.
Mm-hmm.
Halloween is a really good time to pay attention to that, because you will start seeing many sorts of images of bats and black cats and so on. Pay attention to how they're presented.
Right.
Scary music,
Mm-hmm.
dark looking, in a grungy sort of environment. I love bats and find them, they're very, very fascinating, but the way that the media often presents them is, ooh, this is a creepy, scary animal. Yeah.
Very interesting stuff.
Yeah.
This is our final question. What advice would you give to yourself back when you were a student in Psych 101?
Wow. Pay attention. I don't even remember when I was in Psych 101. I took Psych 101 in, it was probably 1976. So I don't remember. I'll just be straight with you. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, probably pay attention. I know I saved my notes for a really long time because I was just kind of like, well, look where this ended up, Yeah. I had no idea the class that I was sitting in would one day be a class that I taught.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I would just say, be open to, different perspectives, and, even if you've never thought about psychology before, be open to learning what you can about it. And I would tell students the same thing in any class that they might be in.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, you may be taking this because you have to,
Yes.
because it's gen ed. But, isn't it more fun to sit in a class going, okay, let me just be open to this and see what I can learn from this, instead of feeling like, oh, I'm really bummed about this.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really valuable piece of advice, especially for the students that are not psychology majors.
Mm-hmm.
So that goes a long way.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Is there any other advice or words of encouragement that you would want to leave us with? If not, then that is all.
No, I think I'm good. It was fun. Thank you.